Welcome, everyone. This is Ken Funenick, and I'm the director of CSU Educator program. I'm about to introduce the speakers for today's Teacher Educator community meeting. I'm actually redoing the beginning of it because we lost the beginning of the recording, but I'm going to repeat what I said to the group. Today was the day when many of us from around the CSU were to meet in Long Beach for our annual teacher recruitment workshop. That meeting, like virtually every face-to-face meeting all of us had on our calendars, was scrapped. Teacher recruitment remains a very high priority for the CSU, but the COVID-19 pandemic and the state shelter-in-place policy has forced us to deal with some additional and immediate and very pressing issues. Today, Dr. Marquita Greneau-Shire, Assistant Vice Chancellor for Educator Preparation and Public School Programs for the CSU, and I'm pleased to announce Mary Sandy, Executive Director for the Commission on Teacher Credentialing, will talk about where things stand right now with respect to teacher credentialing. This part of the meeting today will last about 35 minutes. Then Dr. Bita Ghafouri, Professor of Counseling Psychology at CSU Long Beach and Director of the Campus Trauma Recovery Center, will talk about identifying and managing the stresses related to COVID-19. She will speak for about 30 minutes and then take questions from all of you. With that, I will turn it over to you, Marquita. Thanks very much.
Ones are well. This has been, as everyone is saying, and as everyone is feeling, an unprecedented time period in our lives. It has been a very short amount of time here in California, where we have, for the most part, successfully transitioned to this virtual instruction, both in K-12 and in our higher ed settings. And I have been gratified and amazed and awed by all of you who have continued to provide support and instruction for your students. So on behalf of all of us at the Chancellor's Office, and I know I speak for my Chancellor because he regularly says thank you, I also share my thank you to all of you for your continued good work. Let me say a special thank you to Ken Funenick, who, as he just mentioned, is going to really retire this time. Ken is faculty emeritus at Sacramento State, and I had the wisdom to pull him into some of our department work, and it has been a pleasure and an honor to have Ken working alongside our team. So thank you, Ken. I also want to thank Mary Vixie Sandy, Executive Director, who will be joining us, who is here this morning. And Mary has been working tirelessly over the last several weeks on behalf of our candidates. And I know she has some information she'd like to share and some words to candidates. And then, of course, my colleague, Bita Ghafouri, who I had the pleasure of working with when I was at Cal State Long Beach. It is so good to see all of you. Our purpose today, as Ken said, is twofold. We're going to spend the first bit of time talking about clinical placements, and then the majority of the time, I'm going to let Dr. Ghafouri talk about trauma during this pandemic. So let me go ahead and start and give you an overview in regards to where we are with clinical placements. As you know, because of the COVID-19 situation, there are several areas which may prevent candidates from completing their program this semester. These include the fact that testing centers have closed down. In the Chancellor's Office, we have addressed that through a temporary change to one of our executive orders. Second area is course completion. Third area is completion of clinical hours. Fourth is RECA, and then fifth is the teaching performance assessment. Many of us have been having conversations with colleagues across the segments and with our K-12 partners and with commission staff about these areas. And the areas of concern continue to be RECA and the teaching performance assessment. Commission staff have recommended a number of options that will be presented to the commissioners next week at our April meeting. And at that time, we will have direction to the field and to our candidates, I want to assure you, and I know Mary's going to do this, that in all of our conversations and in all of our problem solving, we've kept our candidates front and center of our decisions. And that's really important for you to hear. I know, because I hear from candidates and I hear from faculty, that it doesn't seem like that, but I can assure you that we have, and we continue to work together to try and find a path forward. So I would encourage you to go to the commission website and look at the agenda items that are posted and provide your thoughtful feedback to the commissioners as we continue to address primarily the teaching performance assessment, but it's not limited to that, and help us through this over the next couple of weeks. So with that, I want to invite my colleague, Mary, to say a few words about where we are on Friday, April 17th.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to see all of you. I confess I prefer the in-person contact to this, but this is far, far better than nothing. So we have been working vigorously every single day for the last 3 weeks to understand what roadblocks programs and candidates are going to hit, and to analyze our own education code and regulations and policies to determine what flexibilities that the commission itself, without any action, can offer, and then to dig more deeply into what are the kinds of things that might require emergency legislation or some other action at a level outside the commission. So that's been a fairly constant analysis. And as we all know, with COVID, circumstances and conditions and contexts change every 2 hours, it seems. And so we feel like we're at a period of kind of constant analysis, response, adjustment, analysis, response. So that's good. Our work is not finished, but where we are at the moment, and with some of the very first guidance we put out to programs, we were really urging innovation in this new space, and we have been just amazed. I mean, truly amazed at what the educator preparation sector has been able to do in very short order to make online experiences available for their candidates, to work with their candidates, to stay in touch with their master teachers. What the K-12 sector has done to make online learning or distance learning in some way available to 6.2 million children in this state is nothing short of astonishing. My hats have always been off to teachers. I think that teachers are some of the most amazing people in our society, and what I see them doing in this crisis equals what I saw them doing in the wildfire crises. And it's just nothing short of amazing. So from an optimistic point of view, I see this huge opportunity for our candidates to experience what crisis teaching is like, what having to change up your practice immediately is like. And they are riding along and working with their master teachers and bringing a skill set to this, how do you do this in a distance learning way, into the mix in ways that I think are extremely productive for everyone. I've been thinking a lot about the word angst for me, because it characterizes so much of what we're experiencing. And the angst is that we can't reconcile to complete harmony the circumstances we're experiencing with all of the good work we're doing. COVID is frightening and anxiety producing for everyone, and I'm thrilled about the second part of this webinar. And that anxiety propels and works its way into every conversation we're having, whether we know it or not. So there's a lot of that angst, but it is propelling enormously good work and innovation in this sector, and we're excited about that. So our earliest guidance to the field was to use this opportunity to get very creative and innovative with your candidates about what counts for clinical practice. And that's happening, and that's just happening on the natural. That's where you're going. There are some things that we can change, that we can adapt and modify, that are on the commission's agenda for next year or next week. For instance, the 600 hours of clinical practice. We're going to need to be innovative about that, and we're asking the commission to look at how we can rely on the work that you're doing in your programs with your candidates and the judgments you're making about their readiness to move on. We have requirements for a specific number of formal observations that need to occur. Again, we're recommending that the commission look at providing flexibility there so that programs can determine what is sufficient in this moment. The 4 weeks of solo teaching, again, that has a particular structure and set of expectations around it that we can't meet in all the ways we thought we might meet. So we're recommending the commission to look at either suspending or modifying how that occurs. So there are a number of things, as Marquita said, that are on the commission's agenda to look at how we can suspend or modify temporarily the standards so that we don't have artificial barriers to this work. There are things that we cannot change by commission action, and those things are written into code or regulation. The completion of a teaching performance assessment or an administrator performance assessment or a RECA or a CSET or a CBEST, those things we cannot change. Those are in code. We're working with the legislature and others on solutions that will ease or remove, if possibly suspend, these barriers for the time being. We do have an option that we've been discussing this for about 3 weeks with all of the communities, the deans, the directors, and others who have been in conversation with us. The variable term waiver solution is on our commission's agenda. We encouraged every institution to put in a request to the commission to be able to recommend your candidates for a variable term waiver. This is a safety net that is available to your candidates that will allow them to obtain work in the fall and to continue and meet their requirements that they haven't been able to meet this year over the course of the first year or two of their practice. There are issues with this. By no means is this an easy solution, but it is a solution that will keep what we estimate to be around 8,500 candidates moving forward in their work and moving into the schools where we really need them to be. So the commission does have the ability to approve those waiver requests, and then programs will have the ability to recommend their candidates for a variable term waiver, which then gives them the ability to seek and secure employment and move into, we hope, an induction space with the support of their program to continue and finish off the performance assessment piece of this, which is, it's a piece that some of them are able to work in the online and distance learning spaces right now to collect evidence and submit their portfolios for teaching performance assessments or administrator performance assessments. And we are working with the assessors to make sure they're ready to see those as, normative practice. It's just in a slightly different setting. So we're trying to move forward on all fronts, make sure that every single candidate in preparation this year has a pathway forward. We have basic infrastructure for that right now in play. We're continuing to work on how to refine those solutions, those pathways, so that we ease the burdens as much as we possibly can for candidates who must continue and move forward. I think the most important thing for all of us, back to the idea and the presence of angst in our community as we grapple with these challenges, is to try not to lose heart. And towards that end, the chair of our commission, Tina Sloan, and I jointly penned a letter to candidates that we've sent out to all of the deans and directors this morning, and we hope that you will pass those on to your students. If nothing else, what we're trying to communicate to them is our commitment to continue to work to find flexible pathways forward for them, to remind them that they are desperately needed in the schools. Their future students need them and need them to be well prepared for the work that they're going to undertake, and that we're going to do everything we can to help them get there, get credentialed, and become part of this profession. So I'm happy to answer any questions that I can for you.
Mary, thank you for that overview and the update on the progress that we're making. And thank you again to you and all of your staff, and to Tina Sloan for your efforts over these last month or so. I really really appreciate all of you very much. So we have time for a couple of questions, and I'm looking at the chat box right now. There's a question from Joanne. Is there any thinking about students who get the variable term waiver finding a district that offers induction? Is the concern there, Joanne, that candidates or students might have trouble?
Yes,
District?
yes. Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about some options that we might be able to provide, with at least within the CSU system-wide. We have thought about providing an online induction support course that might focus on the teaching performance assessment. So I would encourage all of the faculty here and the supervisors to share with me your ideas about how we support our candidates in induction. I think you may know that Cal State Teach offers an online induction course that we're looking at, perhaps expanding that to provide support to our candidates. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat box.
Let's see if a few come in. I want to just say this. I've gotten a couple of messages that people lost their connection to the Zoom call, and it may be that we're at 100, and maybe there's a limit, but we are recording this, so I'm going to email all of you a link to where that recording will be, so you can share it with your colleagues. I'm also going to see if I can produce a transcript of the call so that there's something that people can read if you're having difficulty hearing. There's a question from Mark Felton.
Mary, could you spend a little bit more time talking about alternative solutions to the variable term waiver? As Mary indicated, when the commission staff first started grappling with the questions that were coming from the field, the variable term waiver at the time seemed to be a path forward, and it still is necessary for some of our candidates who may not have completed all of the requirements. Mary, can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, so yes, there are things we can control and things we cannot control. So what is in statute is that the teaching performance assessment is required to be embedded in programs and passed before a credential is issued, a preliminary credential. So to alter that particular requirement would require action by the legislature or the administration. And we are in conversations about how we might be able to work with that to not to suspend it altogether, because we firmly believe that preparation is really quite critical for this cohort. And while their program has been interrupted significantly by COVID, they still have a right to preparation. And while candidates may not see this as a right, they see it as an obligation that has not been removed from them yet. I think that the pathways we're looking for are pathways that award them more time to do it and don't keep them out of the workforce while they're doing it. So the variable term waiver does that. It does provide them the ability to obtain a position and to complete that requirement over the course of a year or two. That's also true for RECA. That if they go on a variable term waiver, the initial issuance would be for 1 year with the ability to extend it to a second year. They would be ideally associated with the kind of course support that Marquita is describing, which I think is a really important contribution that preparation can make to these candidates as they move forward, is to really facilitate their access to that kind of support while they finish this. But they also ideally will be enrolled in or working within an induction program. And that's what they would have to be enrolled or involved in anyway when they obtain a position on a preliminary credential. So our goal is for them to be able to move into that context and get that on the ground mentoring and coaching to help backfill for the things that they missed at the end of this year. So we are working with the K-12 employer community and the HR community, and we'll be communicating extensively with them as the commission takes their action next week to provide guidance about who are these people, and what is it that you need to do with them to help them get through the waiver. In conversations I've had with the employer community, I am assured that jobs will be there and that these candidates who are almost fully prepared are going to be competitive because they're almost fully prepared, and they are, vastly preferred over emergency permit holders or substitute teachers who are not prepared for this work. So that's where everybody's headspace is. What needs to happen next is commission action on these things, and then we will provide more specific guidance and continue to work on refinements that will try to make this easier for candidates.
Let me address a couple of questions that have come up in the chat box, and then again ask Mary to elaborate a bit. Julie asks, a concern is that the variable term waiver candidates who don't get hired may have to pay in order to complete their TPA. Again, we've been having conversations about what that might look like, both at the university level and in the district and with our district partners, and what kind of financial support we might be able to provide our candidates. I'm sorry to be so not clear on an answer, but as Mary said, we are talking about this every day, and we're trying to come up with solutions that minimize the impact. So we are thinking about how we might support our candidates, and it might be through extension, it might be through some external funding. Another question from Marianne, again, you're not going to like this answer from me, is no, we can't speak more about the work that's going on. As with all of the COVID-19 situation, things change on a daily basis. I have assured my dean colleagues and my associate dean colleagues that we continue to work on this with commission staff. As Mary indicated, there are conversations happening in Sacramento that may help us to address this. Mary, I don't know if there's anything else you could say about that.
I think you've captured it. It's it's a daily push to find solutions and to ease the process for candidates. I do see a question here from Sylvia related to whether VTW candidates on a waiver will be meeting both preliminary and induction requirements simultaneously. Ideally, I think yes. The work, if they're working on, let's just take for instance a concrete example, Cal TPA Cycle 2, which is to design a unit of instruction and describe the assessment work that you'll be doing with your students across that unit. Developing that in your own practice on a waiver, working in a classroom with your own students will provide you access to the material you need, which is teaching and learning in your own classroom. And the coaching and support that you get from a mentor teacher during induction would now on the natural be focused on these kinds of things. Here's a unit of instruction. These are the assessments that I'm developing for that. Working with your coach on that is a natural type of activity that occurs in induction anyway. So our goal would be that these candidates would be making progress in induction and progress to complete their preliminary simultaneously, and that they wouldn't have to finish the preliminary work and then begin induction anew. We're looking for this to be a simultaneous activity. And again, we're talking with the employer community and the induction community and planning to provide as much support as we can to the induction community to really prepare them for this being a slightly different approach, but it's not a completely alien approach. These are the things you work on in induction. So that's what I have to say about that.
I'm looking at the chat box and I see some real technical questions that I'd like to suggest that we consult with some of Mary's staff and post responses to these questions. There's a comment about making sure that we're hearing from the field, from the supervisors and the university faculty that are on the ground with our candidates. And I have two responses to that. Please share your comments and your feedback with your deans and associate deans. That's the mechanism in the CSU that we use so that I and my team can hear your feedback I forgot what else I was going to say. We have been consulting with supervisors and candidates. I've been hearing directly from candidates over the last month, but I would encourage you again to use your dean and associate deans or your directors to get the information that we need to hear. So I think I'm looking one more. All right, I appreciate that, Mark. I think what, Ken, I would like to do now is we'll respond to these questions. I'm going to ask Mary if her team can respond to the real technical questions and then get back to participants. I'd like us now to turn to our colleague, Bita Ghaffori, who has great experience both in research and practice related to trauma. And it is my pleasure to turn it over to Bita now. Thank you.
Let me just say one quick thing. Thank you, Mary and Marquita. And Bita, I will bring up your PowerPoint in just a moment. I think that if you, Marquita, and Mary have some additional responses or information, and if I can get that from you, Marquita, I will post those responses along with the recording, and I think I can also produce a transcript. And for all of you who registered for this webinar, I will send out links to those documents within the next few days. I think now I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and I hope you can all see it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Bita Ghaffori from Long Beach State.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
we can.
All right, hello everyone. And thank you so much, Marquita and Ken, for inviting me today. I'm happy to speak with you about an area which is, of course, an area that's been near and dear to my heart for many, many years. And unfortunately, during this pandemic, we are all dealing with trauma, a societal trauma, a community level trauma. And I'm hoping to provide some information and also maybe answer questions you may have with respect to this. As Marquita had mentioned, I am a professor at Cal State Long Beach, but also a director of the Long Beach Trauma Recovery Center, which has been open since 2014. And we have provided services, mental health services, to individuals who have experienced all kinds of traumas, but specifically with relation to the various disasters and unfortunate events like the Las Vegas shooting, wildfires that have happened in our regional communities as well. So I'll just move forward. If you could just go to the next slide. So I thought it might be helpful for us to start with a quote from Marie Curie that I think is really helpful during these times in particular. Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. And I find this to be a helpful quote because there is a lot of fear right now with respect to the pandemic that we're all experiencing. Next slide. So in terms of a pandemic, I know that you all are living in the pandemic and you know what a pandemic is, but this COVID-19 pandemic has caused our world to enter uncharted situations, and educators, researchers, healthcare workers, public health individuals are desperately trying to keep up with all of the new developments. While this pandemic is unique, there is a significant and growing body of research and literature on the psychological and behavioral health consequences of disasters that could potentially provide guidance to us all. Next slide. So the first thing I want to talk about is media images, because we all are consumers of the news in various forms. And I think that media images are important to understand, important to think about, and especially with respect to your work as educators and in terms of helping teacher candidates and teachers in schools, because research which has been done over the last decade or so has shown that a small amount of engaging in media, whether it's social media, news, or any other type of information is helpful, but as we all know, excessive amounts of media watching are quite harmful, actually. There's been research from the Zika virus as well as Ebola that have shown that if individuals watch more than 2 hours or engage in 2 hours or more of media coverage, they actually may get secondary trauma symptoms. So this is just something to keep in mind. And in terms of collective anxiety and stress, and I put these images up because these are just some of the things that we all deal with currently. We know that there's been lots and lots of issues with respect to getting important goods. Toilet paper is just one of them, but one of the images shows the empty shelves, which we all are experiencing when we go to stores sometimes. Are ways of relaxing, disengaging, including sports, have been banned and they haven't necessarily been available to us. So another thing that we know is from past research is that these types of threats oftentimes are leave people with feeling like they have less control and a sense of dread. And so the coronavirus has all of these elements to increase individual and collective fear, anxiety, and stress. It doesn't mean that people are overreacting. It's appropriate to be concerned. So next slide. So there are various responses to stress, and I actually share this with my students all the time in my classes as well as at the trauma center. We know that a small amount of stress is actually could be quite positive. It helps us to get going. Brief increases in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels are not necessarily bad for us. And sometimes certain amounts of stress are tolerable. These are serious but temporary stress responses. Oftentimes they're buffered by supportive relationships, and prolonged activation of the stress response systems in the absence of protective relationships could be quite toxic. So I think these are also important to keep in mind because we are actually now, we are going on to week 4 of this situation. And you know, right now I would say we're in the tolerable stage for some individuals and toxic for others. So next slide. And we also know from past disasters and research that has been done that quarantine may also cause negative mental health consequences, including traumatic stress symptoms, confusion, and anger, which may impact teacher educators, credential students, teachers, PK-12 students, parents, all of us. So next slide. um, I would love to have this conversation focused on the positive aspects of stress, but I feel as if I kind of need to go down the road of some of the mental health issues, just so that we all are aware of things to think about and keep in mind. Um, so, this COVID-19 with respect to mental health issues has generated a lot of different, I would say, concerns, valid concerns for a lot of people. Fear for loved ones, fear regarding job security and financial security, anxiety regarding social distancing, social withdrawal and loneliness, increased anxiety, increase in previous mental health conditions, hopelessness, and some sleep issues. We are continuing to provide services at the Long Beach Trauma Recovery Center. And so we've moved everything to telemental health. And so we've been monitoring some of these things in our own clients as well. And we know that these issues exist, and that coping in these times is particularly important, and having good coping strategies in place. Next slide. So some other warning signs in terms of, well, I think we skipped one, but maybe go back to one, Ken. Emotional irritability, I think is one that is coming up quite a bit. Low tolerance, overwhelming emotions. For people who have had various traumas in the past, sometimes situations like this COVID-19 situation really contribute to flashbacks or nightmares related to past traumas, helplessness, burnout, sometimes suicidal thoughts, fear, anxiety. Let's move on to the next slide. Behavioral symptoms may include isolation or drinking or increased drinking, risky behaviors, feelings of losing control, confusion and past and present danger, change in eating habits, staying on guard, insomnia. Sleep is really an issue that that I think is important to think about. I don't know about you all, but not necessarily having a routine in place can impact just about anyone's sleep. And I think that sleep and having some semblance of a routine with relation to sleep and actually your entire day is really, really preventative of mental health issues. So we'll move on. I just was listening to Marquita talk about some of the issues that your teacher candidates are having, and the educators that you work with. And I think that we've all moved very, very quickly into this online world, providing things through Zoom and other platforms, being able to still try to do our work while we're in the middle of this trauma. And I think that it's stressful, to say the least. And for some people, it may be causing some level of burnout, which is characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, a reduced sense of personal accomplishment or worth. And for some people, this may actually be causing some sort of vicarious trauma symptoms. So let's move on to the next slide. But we do know that there are adaptive coping strategies that each one of us can incorporate into our daily lives to help reduce some of these negative mental health consequences, which I've just described. And I'm going to go into detail about some of these in the next few slides. But just to review, this is something that we can do for ourselves. This is something that we can do with our families. We can do with the individuals that we work with children as well. Talking to others is really helpful, particularly when you're feeling stressed, when you're feeling like you have burnout, when you're feeling overwhelmed and you're feeling scared because every day things are changing. So talking to people certainly does help if you have a support system in place with individuals that you trust. But if not, there are professionals that are available online now that could potentially be sources of that could potentially be individuals who you choose to talk with. Taking regular breaks is certainly an important coping strategy. I think that I have heard now from all of my employees and my students at the Trauma Center who are now doing everything on Zoom, as well as my colleagues and just individuals I know personally. Being online all the time is exhausting. It's actually more exhausting than our normal routines. That it probably has to do with many things, this rapid switch into a new way of doing things. But taking regular breaks is certainly helpful. Eating healthy meals is another really helpful coping strategy. Exercising and incorporating exercise into your daily routine. Of course, developing and sticking to routines. At the Trauma Center, on our social media, we have a Facebook and an Instagram. From day one of this pandemic, where we were told that we couldn't necessarily go back to the center, we've been putting various ways of coping on our social media that people could potentially utilize. And I think one of our most popular is how to develop and stick to routines. We've gotten a lot of feedback on that particular post. Using relaxation methods, focusing on practical things, and sometimes journaling. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so what can we do to take care of ourselves and our students? I mentioned talking to someone as a really great coping skill. Have a support system in place, and this can be an online support network. I've noticed that there are various forms of support online that are available. I know at our university we've been getting emails about that. At the Trauma Center, we have an online support network for our staff and students. But this is certainly something that could be helpful. And then, of course, engaging in some sort of self-care techniques, such as turning off the news. I know for myself, I enjoy watching the news, but I try to limit it to no more than 1 or 2 hours. Take a break and engage in physical or pleasurable activity. Journal. Grounding and breathing techniques are quite helpful, and then connecting with other people in your community, and you can do that online as well. Next slide. So some self-help strategies. When you notice your mood is changing, write down your negative automatic thoughts. This is really quite helpful, and our clinicians who are until the COVID-19 situation, we have had clinicians at various schools in Long Beach Unified School District, and our clinicians are still continuing to work with students who were identified as having issues related to trauma. And this is something that we actually teach our youth as well, to write down those negative automatic thoughts and how they're feeling. Because when you actually put it on paper, sometimes it's a release in and of itself. And really kind of looking at it and evaluating it. How could you potentially feel better engaging in that type of thinking? Next slide. So if you're having a particular thought, such as, I'm feeling as if this is never going to end, what are some of the causes of that? Could it be excessive news watching? Could it be what the people around you are saying? And what are some solutions to help you in the moment? And what can you act on? And then, of course, practicing in positive self-talk is really helpful as well. You don't have to make decisions right away. And reminding yourself of that is really important. And this will pass. It will pass. We don't know how long it's going to take, but it will pass. And we know that because we've had past disasters. We've had virus situations such as Ebola, Zika, that have come in, caused quite a bit of harm in the communities they've impacted, but they too have passed. So develop a schedule. That's always really helpful. I know for myself, I go out for a walk every single day because I need to. And eating light, balanced meals, trying to get some sleep, deep breathing. There are a lot of apps out there that help with all of the things that I've mentioned: deep breathing, grounding, engaging in positive self-talk. There are apps that are helpful for quite a lot of things that are quite good. Let's go to the next slide. So the power of positive thinking. When in December, before all of this happened, I was invited to go to a conference in Chile, and I was their keynote speaker. And my talk focused on resilience. And one of the participants, after I finished my talk, had shared with me that, everything that you say has a lot to do with being optimistic and having just engaging in positive thinking and learning how to engage in positive thinking, even in the roughest times. And I actually think that's quite true, but it's learned. And just like sometimes our worry and our anxiety and our feelings of dread are also learned. Sometimes they're evoked by situations that we're in, very understandably, but we can really focus on trying to change that because this will pass. So, next slide. It is also, there is no shame in asking for help, professional help when you need it. I know that at Cal State Long Beach, we have an employee assistance program and we have CAPS, but the Long Beach Trauma Recovery Center is open to anyone. We are state funded, and we provide no-cost mental health services to anyone who's experiencing a traumatic event, and COVID-19 and this pandemic is considered a trauma. And so we do provide therapeutic services to anyone who really needs it. Next slide. We also have resources that we are developing. I've shared a couple of them, specifically coping strategies for families and children that I shared with Ken, and I'm hoping that he shares it with all of you as well. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I left my email. Thank you so much.
Looks like we have a lot of questions in the chat box. I think some of them were still related to what Mary and Marquita were talking about. But Beta, do you want to see if there are some items in the chat box you want to respond to?
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. Trying to figure out which ones were directed towards me. COVID-19 pandemic trauma is real for our students. Thank you for getting this information out. Okay. Yes, it is real. It is very real. And we know that some of our students are really struggling. They're struggling personally, and they're attempting to do their jobs as well, or continue in their internships or their training programs. And I think that if we could provide as many resources as we can during this time to really kind of help them with their own emotional issues that they may have, and not necessarily, I guess, engaging in a practice that this is not normal, but it actually is normal to have emotional issues during this time. I think that might be really helpful.
Beta, there was a question about app recommendations. I think you referenced apps as a way to provide some relaxation and calming.
Yeah.
Can you recommend any?
Yeah, I definitely can. Would you like me to put together like a handout, and then I can send it to you, Ken, and then you can share it with the group?
Yeah, I think a handout, including some of the very specific recommendations in your PowerPoint, and then along with the recommendations on apps and anything else that comes to mind, and I'll post that as well.
Okay, I will be happy to do that.
Just seeing if there's any other. questions for you. I think,
I just posted one, Ken.
Rod, is that you?
Yeah, it's me. It's the very most recent comment there.
Can you talk about and provide references for large group trauma treatment? So we offer a group at the trauma center. But in terms of large group, we've provided like I would say more like a seminars, single or possibly 2-session groups in person for various different issues. For example, there was an attempted shooting at a Marriott hotel in Long Beach, and we went out to and provided like almost like a support group twice for all of the employees at that hotel. And we're happy to do that again. We usually customize it to the needs of the organization. So if there is a desire for us to put together some sort of group, we're happy to do that. That's well within our mission at the trauma center. Just contact me and let me know what you would like, and I'm happy to provide that for you as well.
Do you see Robert's question, Beta? He had another question about chronic trauma, I think he's referring to, as opposed to a single event.
Yeah. Okay, I see it. So in terms of the chronic, we generally recommend that you continue, like for example, if there's an issue that you think that you need additional help for, you could potentially contact us for either a referral, or alternatively we do offer a group ourselves. You could potentially join our group, and right now it's all online through Zoom. But I hope I answered your question now. So if there are chronic issues, I would say that just contact us, and we're happy to talk further about what the specific recommendations would be.
Robert, feel free to chime in. It looked like you wanted to say something to the group or to Beta.
Yeah, I apologize. Beta, I'm doing this for the good of the group. I'm a licensed psychologist, and one of my frustrations has been that I work with one-on-one or one family at a time. But this is a public health emergency crisis, I should say. And our traditional models have to be really carefully examined and modified to address groups of 20 students, 25 students, 30 students at a time. The San Francisco Unified School District is surveying the experience of trauma, and then they're going to try to develop some interventions for the fall. So what I'm trying to get a sense of is, yes, there's brief incident responding, and yes, we want to do some follow-up on an individual basis, but the schools, I think, are trying to figure out, how do we deal with masses, thousands of students at a time in groups of, say, 20, 30? I don't know if there's an answer to that question. I'm hoping that there is, because it's much more of a public health approach rather than the traditional psychology approach. I'm talking about like groups, 20, 30, maybe an assembly.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I've actually been talking about that with my colleagues as well, because as I mentioned, we do work with the Long Beach Unified School District, and we anticipate that there will need to be a different approach than our traditional psychological approaches that we've taken, that are mostly individual and some support groups, but more in terms of education, providing trainings to the students, providing small seminars to the students, small group seminars, and we haven't necessarily identified how many individuals would potentially be involved with that, but also doing it across the board. So it is a public health approach. We haven't completed our, I guess, a development of that process yet, but I think it's a great idea, and one that potentially may need to be done, because there may be individual students who would never come forward with mental health issues, but that we can provide information, I think, to larger groups that could be beneficial to all.
Vita, I have a question for you. In we have a database of 600 or so people who have expressed interest in becoming teachers, and I'd like to send a message out to them, just one of reassurance and urging them to continue thinking about becoming a teacher. But more immediately, I want to invite them to do something if they feel like they need to talk to someone. And we have a web page on our Educator website with contact information for all of the advisors on every campus. Does it make sense for me to encourage people who are, say, undergraduates to talk to advisors who may not have any mental health experience, but could be there as a person that people could contact at a campus where they might be attending, perhaps to talk about credentialing issues, but maybe just to talk to them about how they're doing? Or would you recommend, if they are dealing with psychological problems or challenges, that they call and contact someone differently than, say, an academic advisor?
Yeah. That's also a really great question, and one that we started talking about at Cal State Long Beach last year, because sometimes students do go to their academic advisors. They don't necessarily feel very comfortable. Maybe it's stigma, maybe it's another reason to reach out to a mental health professional. And so I know that at Long Beach last year, we did a training on how to kind of identify and respond to trauma. And many advisors attended our training. So I think advisors are probably a great group of people for an initial contact, especially if they have some understanding of how to refer out, because it isn't necessarily their job. If the person has issues which require professional assistance.
So maybe when people call or contact an advisor, some advice for advisors is to make sure that they first ask the people calling in, how are you doing?
Yeah.
And if they feel like perhaps they should have some phone numbers or places to refer them to if it sounds like the person is really struggling and beyond what the academic advisor can do much about.
That sounds like a good plan.
There's a question from Urania Lopez from San Francisco about can you speak about how this might play out if there are differences culturally?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it definitely can play out differently depending on culture. We also know from the research that we've done at the Trauma Recovery Center, some of my own research, which looks at cultural differences in trauma and the manifestation of trauma symptoms, as well as seeking help. We also know that there are cultures who are highly reluctant to seek help during trauma situations such as COVID-19 or other trauma situations. And that one strategy to be able to reach out to cultures who are potentially reluctant to seek help is to provide a lot of public education on signs and symptoms of health, and then concern. Some of the things that I actually mentioned in my PowerPoint as well, some of the emotional signs, some of the behavioral signs that are concerning and that potentially you might want to talk to someone about. So I know that one strategy that we have used at the Trauma Center is we actually go out and do a lot of educational trainings to various schools. We do it in community settings. We've done it for the police department. And just different groups in general. And each time we do these types of what I call outreach events, where we provide education and pamphlets and what are the signs and symptoms that you may be in distress, we always get people who would never ever consider seeking help calling us and wanting to know more about it. Not necessarily saying that that's what they want, but they want to know a little bit more about it, which is a great way to engage people who would have a lot of difficulty culturally.
It looks like I don't have any additional questions for you to respond to, Vida. I want to just personally thank you for preparing your presentation, for being with us today. I think it's enormously helpful to all of us. I want to thank Marquita, Renaud Shire, and Mary, excuse me, Mary Sandy for responding at a very difficult time. As Mary said, things are changing by the hour. I did post a link to a PSD newsletter that comes out regularly from CTC with updates, and I would urge you to follow that link and sign up for the newsletter coming from the CTC. And again, I'll be posting a recording of this call along with, I think I can get a transcript produced. And then Beta is going to be sending me some notes and some more specific recommendations, which I can post. Also, the chat box log I will post, and I'll be sending to all of you an email with a link to our diversity toolkit, which is where this will be posted. Marquita, would you like to just say some final words to the group?
Well, good morning again, colleagues, and thank you for your questions and for the work that you do every day. I'll join Ken in thanking my colleagues, Beta and Mary, once again. These are really, really busy times for all of us, and I appreciate how you carved off a little bit of time to spend with us this morning thinking about these important issues. So thank you. I think we're giving you a gift of 27 minutes this morning to get back to your daily routines. Take really good care of all of your family and your loved ones and yourselves, and we'll be seeing you soon. Take good care. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.